I bring a pencil or let's say a crayon, and I bring a razor blade and put it and divide it, that is not an imaginary plane, that is a real plane. I divided something. The next region we're going to be looking at now is the pelvic region, but before then, let's do a quick summary of the abdominal region. So we have the 9 regions of the abdominal region. We have the epigastric region, we have the left and right hypochondriac region, we have the umbilical region, we have the left and the right lumbar region, then we have the hypogastric region, we have the left and right inguinal or iliac region. So now we're going to be looking at the pelvic region. Now this is a region that composes of all of your reproductive organs. So several of your reproductive organs are found in your pelvic region. So when you talk about all the internal reproductive organs of a female, we're going to be looking at it in the pelvic region. All right, all the internal reproductive organs of the male, we're going to be looking at it at the pelvic region. Then we'll also talk about several of the external reproductive organs of both male and female. It's also in the pelvic and perineal region. So that's the region where we're going to study all of those organs. Okay, now when we look at the back region, we're going to be looking at things like your scapula, we're going to be looking at things like your vertebrae, and then when we look at the appendicular parts of your body, we're going to be looking at your limbs, the upper limb and the lower limb. Okay, now the upper limb comprises of several bones, your humerus, your radius and your ulna, and then we have the phalanges. All right, when we look at the lower limb, we're going to be looking at the thigh, the bone of the thigh, which is a femur. Okay, then we're going to be looking at the tibia and the fibula. Then we're going to be looking at all of the bones of your toe. All right, so that is what we'll be looking at in the regions that have to do with the limbs. Is that okay? So we're going to be looking at the branches of human anatomy. All right, so now hear this. When you come to study anatomy, it's important that you understand that anatomy is divided into different branches. Okay, the first is the macroscopic anatomy. That's branch number 1. Macro, anything macro is large. Okay, anything macro is large. So macroscopic anatomy is the study of structures that are visible to the eyes. Okay, structures that you can touch, structures that are large enough for you to see them, large enough for you to appreciate them. That is what macroscopic anatomy is. All right, when we come to macroscopic anatomy, we have several branches, about 3. We have the regional anatomy that comprises of studying the regions, head and neck, abdominal region, thoracic region. Then we have systemic anatomy that comprises of studying according to system. Okay, we study the systems, all right, like your digestive system, your reproductive system, and what have you. All of the system, okay, that's systemic anatomy. Then we have surface anatomy. Here you study majority of the surfaces. All right, so that's what comprises of, that's what is composed of in macroscopic anatomy. That's what we have in macroscopic anatomy. I hope this is clear to this point. The second branch, okay, is micro, macro, micro. Okay, so micro is the study, microscopic anatomy is a study of the anatomy of, is a study of structures that are not visible to the eyes. Okay, structures that are not large enough for you to appreciate them. Okay, we have 2 divisions in this, we have 2 subdivisions in this. The first is cell, okay, cell, okay, you getting it? Cytology is the study of cell, the cellular component. So when you get a structure, studying it at the cellular component, okay, to know the kind of cell that it is comprised of, that it is made up of. Okay, this is cytology. Then we have tissue. So histology, study of tissues. Cyto, cell. Tissue. Cyto, cell. Okay, so histology is a study of tissues. So we are studying the different kind of tissues that that makes up an organ or makes up any structure. Is that okay? Then we have developmental anatomy. Developmental, okay, also called embryology. So you know that an embryo is developing. Okay, so developmental anatomy or embryology. This is the study of development. It is the study of how cells, how a full organism can be derived from a single cell. So it is in developmental anatomy that you see that a zygote can result from the fusion of an egg cell and a sperm cell. Okay, these are a lot of things that we're going to. I told you, here we cook, we serve you delicacies on anatomy, and you eat. Do you understand? So developmental anatomy, it is development. We are studying how a single cell, the zygote. I hope you know that when an egg cell meets with a sperm cell, they give rise to another cell that is not an egg, that is not a sperm. When we were younger, my sister would get a Coke from my mom, I would get a Fanta. Well, my brother will get a Coke from my mom, I will get a Fanta. You know what we do? I will drink from my Fanta, he will drink from his Coke. Then he will not tell me to pour into his Fanta, but into his Coke, while he pours into my Fanta. Now, when that happens, the component or the substance that we have is no longer a Coke, it is no longer a Fanta, it is I call it Kofa. Okay, so it is something else that is not a Coke, it's not a Fanta. You cannot get a Coke from it again, I cannot get a Fanta from it again, except some other very special thing occurred in that particular one, right? But for a cell, when an egg cell comes and fuses together with a sperm cell, several processes entails and goes on to ensure that is possible, which we will look at when we come to developmental anatomy. All right, so when that happens, we have a single cell that is formed, and that is a zygote that will now continue the process of cleaving to now give rise to an embryo. And so this is what we study in embryology. How does all of those things happen before we now have the full organism? That's what we do in developmental anatomy. So that's the third branch of human anatomy. So the fourth branch is comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy, this is very simple. This is the study of different species of organisms, all right, to see how evolution affected them and how evolution occurs and how they are related evolutionarily. Okay, so I start hearing peckerman, I start hearing ape, then man came from ape, and all of those what have yous. Right, this is what we study in comparative anatomy. Then we have clinical anatomy. Clinical anatomy, this is the aspect of anatomy that has to do with functionality, has to do with clinical functionality. How you now apply the basic knowledge you have in anatomy in clinical terms, how your knowledge of anatomy can be used in ensuring the possibility of clinical procedures. Application, this is application of the structures and all of the knowledge you have in anatomy in clinical sense, right, in the medical sense, application. Then we have radiological anatomy. This is the aspect of anatomy that deals with structures like bony compositions, the study of bony compositions and bony structures and all of that. Okay, so the study of these bony structures using not only bony structures anyway, but bony structures using the X-ray and several other internal structures, anatomical structures using the CT scan, the MRI, and several other imaging techniques. All right, and then finally we have the pathological anatomy. Now, in this aspect of anatomy, we're studying tissues. Okay, several tissues and several diseases that can affect several tissues. Is that okay? Good.
Another thing we're going to be looking at now is anatomical positions. Anatomical position. Okay, now anatomical position is how the body is expected to be in areas, in times of reference and studies. Okay, it is exactly how the human body is expected to be when being studied or when being handled by healthcare professionals, anatomists, and every other professional that need to assess the body. Okay, what is this position? Okay, so the first thing you need to know about anatomic position is that, number one, the body has to be standing upright and erect. I'm sitting, but of course you see the picture on the screen. The body has to be standing erect. Okay, erect, face forward. nose and eyes forward, arms hanging by the side with the palm facing forward. You're going to see it on the picture on the screen. With the palm facing forward, with the feet flat on the floor, okay, and the toes pointing forward. That is what anatomical position entails. So you cannot have an anatomy, a body or a specimen or a structure standing that is not erect. That is not anatomical position. You cannot be tilting your head to another side. That is not anatomical position. You cannot be bending your head downward. That is not anatomical position. You cannot be lifting your hands or waving it by the side or lifting it up or your palm facing down. No. So anatomical position is exactly how it should be right on the screen, with the person standing erect, with your arms hanging down and your palms facing forward, the feet flat on the floor, slightly opened, and then your toe facing forward. Okay, all right. So now we'll be talking about anatomical planes. So what are anatomical planes, or what is anatomical plane, whichever? What are anatomical planes? Because there are many. So what are anatomical planes? These are imaginary planes, all right? Imaginary planes that are used to divide the body. Imaginary is that they are not real, but we have it somewhere in our imagination that this is how the body is being divided, all right? So they are imaginary planes used to divide the body so as to enable us properly describe or properly study or properly handle some organs or some structures in the body, and to also know the positions and the locations of several organs in the body. Do you understand? Imaginary planes used to divide the body. It means that if I bring a pencil or let's say a crayon, and I bring a razor blade and put it and divide it, that is not an imaginary plane. That is a real plane. I divided something and it broke it into two. But something imaginary is there's nothing real. I'm just trying to, by my imagination, divide a pencil or a crayon into two. So I said this is the first half, this is the second half. So that's what we do with anatomical plane. It is an imaginary plane used to divide the body. Okay, so we have some of them, and I'm going to mention about 3 of them. So the first one you need to acquaint yourself with is the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane. Now, what is the sagittal plane? First thing you need to know is that the sagittal plane is an imaginary plane that divides the body through from the median plane into the left and the right part. Okay, so when we say this is the left part, this is the right part, it is a sagittal plane that divides the body into left and right parts. So when we say at the body, we have the same thing we have at the left hand side, the same thing we have at the right hand side, all of those things, we have already drawn an imaginary plane of division through the body that runs sagittally, that divides it to the left and to the right. A sagittal plane, sagittal plane. Is that okay? The second one we'll be looking at is the coronal plane. Okay, so what we call it the frontal plane. Okay, so what it does is to divide the body into front and back, or anterior and posterior. When we get to anatomical directions, you also notice front is anterior, back is posterior, depending. All right, so we put an imaginary plane and divide the body into two. So instead of having the left side and the right side, we'll now be having the front part, the anterior part of your body, and the posterior part of your body. Okay, so when you pass the coronary plane through, what you're having is the anterior and the posterior. Okay, so the third one is the transverse plane. The transverse plane, this is a plane with which we used to divide the body into two halves, superior and inferior. Superior up, inferior down. Superior up, inferior down. So when we pass the transverse plane, it divides the body into divides the body horizontally, okay, into the superior part and the inferior part. So when you're discussing something, you say the cephalic region, we're talking about the region superior, and then you're discussing something and then you say the caudal region is the region inferior, okay. So that's about the anatomical plane. So another thing we're going to be looking at now is anatomical directions. Anatomical directions, okay. Anatomical directions are universal terms that are generally accepted by healthcare professionals and anatomical practitioners, all right, anatomy practitioners, for to be able to describe the location of organs and structures in the body, okay. It's generally universally accepted. Okay, so this is where we'll be rounding off today's class, and we'll continue in our next class. We want to see you in the next class. Please do well to like this video, share, and also comment so this video can get to a lot of persons that need it. All right, we'll see you in our next class. Bye. Thank you for watching.